As a nation enters a third winter of fighting for its very existence, it must wait one ocean away on a domestic partisan feud. Republicans in the U.S. Senate shrugging off Joe Biden's plea not to gift a win to Vladimir Putin and blocking aid for Ukraine over a dispute on funding for border controls with Mexico. Classic Beltway horse trading. What are the life or death consequences, though? What of Washington's street cred as guarantor of the NATO alliance? Speaking of horse trading, guess who's coming to dinner here in Paris? Hungary's Prime Minister, who was recently welcomed in Moscow with open arms. Viktor Orban wants the unfreezing of EU funding blocked over rule of law issues, or he says he'll scupper the bloc's own Ukraine funding at next week's final Brussels summit of the year. How fragile is Western policymaking? What options for Kyiv as it faces a bloody winter stalemate on the battlefield? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if Ukraine can find itself on its own. And with us from Kyiv, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
With us as well, Elena Tregub, Secretary General of the Ukrainian watchdog group NATO, the Independent Defense Anti-Corruption Commission.
Hello.
Welcome to Paris.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Former French diplomat Yves Dutrieux is professor of geopolitics at Paris Dauphine University. Good to see you.
Good evening.
And from Washington, political strategist Douglas Hay, former communications director for the Republican National Committee. Welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. You know there's foreboding when Ukraine's president deems it wiser to cancel a classified briefing for U.S. senators, briefing whose closed-door shouting session prompts the president to use his bully pulpit and try and whip votes.
Make no mistake, today's vote's going to be long remembered, and history's going to judge harshly those who turn their back on freedom's cause. We can't let Putin win.
No. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Sullivan, no.
Biden's pitch failing to make its mark, and now the year is set to end without Congress approving some $50 billion in fresh Ukraine funding. Douglas Hay, what should we be reading into this?
Well, it shows obviously that the funding is a very real issue. And I'd actually argue the bigger problem for Biden in this case are House Republicans, not Senate Republicans. He's been negotiating with Senate Republicans over the past few weeks. James Lankford from Oklahoma taking the lead for Republicans there. But what we've heard from the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is that this is not going to be considered by the House before year's end. The House is going to leave session on December 15, it looks like. And so that leaves this rolling open question going forward. And obviously has caused a lot of concern, and very rightly so, not just in Ukraine, but also in countries around it. I've been to Poland twice in the past 2 years, and the fight there is very real as well.
Yeah, you talk about the looming figure that's not in the upper chamber, but certainly putting on the pressure is the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, who on Tuesday was in the company of the UK's new Foreign Secretary. Yes, that is David Cameron you're seeing on your screens. Mike Johnson, who told fellow Republicans that sweeping changes to U.S. border policy will be, quote, their hill to die on. Is this something he feels strongly about, or is he just scared of Donald Trump?
Well, I don't think it really involves Donald Trump. It's something he really believes, but also is where Republican voters are. And I looked at polling yesterday on these issues. The number one issue for Republican primaries, immigration and the border. The last issue out of 10 was Ukraine. And there are House Republicans, Senate Republicans too, in this case are a very accurate reflection of where their voters are.
And even though you heard Joe Biden's pitch saying that this is about the United States' power abroad and around the globe, that's falling on deaf ears?
Largely it is, and I actually agree with what the president has said on this, and the funding for Ukraine, I think, being very important. Some of this is normal congressional horse trading, as you mentioned earlier. Some of it is where Republican voters are and how they're leading Republican members of Congress and senators. But also, I think part of how we could change this is to talk about this issue differently. What I've seen in polling is that when you talk about how what's happening in Ukraine isn't just war, but the persecution of Christians, the elimination of Christian churches, Republican voters a lot of them evangelical Christian conservatives, react more positively to funding on that. The other thing is, and Biden is doing some of this now, when we talk about funding for Ukraine, I think the perception for most Americans is that they're just planefuls of cash that are going to Ukraine. That's not really what's happening. A lot of that money is being spent on weapons, weapon systems, armaments. And where's that being spent? Right here in the United States with American companies, a lot of whom are in red districts for Republican members of Congress, Republican senators. They need to hear this, and they need to hear it a lot over and over again.
Elena Tregu, the fact that the money's not going to be approved before the end of the year, is that something that can be sorted out, or is this a real risk for Ukraine?
It's a real risk. It's a lifeline for Ukraine. Ukraine is constantly feeling the shortage of munitions, the shortage of weapons on the ground, and now these hard right Republicans, both in the Senate, as we heard, and in the House, who playing with this issue for their political careers, they are gambling not just the future of Ukraine, they are gambling on the future of Europe and ultimately the US as well. Because if they allow Russia to win this war, it's a matter of time when Ukrainian population of those territories that will be controlled by Russia will be used to invade a NATO country, such as, for example, the Baltic states. And Joe Biden probably realizes this threat, but American public probably does not fully realize it.
Yeah, when you hear Douglas Hay describing it, how basically for a lot of voters, Ukraine is far away, you take the point, or do you think this is about something else?
Well, I think definitely their issues, domestic issues, will prevail, especially for Republican voters. This is very clear. And they do not see directly how US can be involved in a global war in case here the security in Europe, in European Union, in NATO will deteriorate further. And this can happen probably not tomorrow, but it can happen in 2-3 years from now. But politicians should be strategic leaders of their countries and foresee those threats and prevent them. But these Republicans currently, they are the best allies of Vladimir Putin right now, more than Iran or North Korea, who don't have the power. But these people now who are blocking aid, they do have the power now.
Gulliver Craig, the relationship between a Ukraine that's steadily moved away from Moscow's sphere since the fall of the Soviet Union and the United States has been a very close one, and not just since February of 2022.
Well, no, certainly the Ukrainians, in their desire to move towards the European Union, have also constantly been counting on the support of the United States. The United States support, particularly really, though, since February 2022 has become absolutely crucial. Volodymyr Zelensky said in September that without US support, Ukraine loses. I'm actually speaking to you not from Kyiv, but from just outside Kyiv, the residence of the former pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych, who fled in February 2014.
Are the golden toilets still there?
No, the toilet I went to wasn't golden. I don't know if there is some with the golden toilets, but investigative journalists have gathered here for a ceremony to award the best reports of the past year. And what I can tell you about the tone here is nobody seems to be talking as though maybe actually this could come back under some kind of puppet president's control again. Nobody's talking in terms of victory maybe not happening, despite Volodymyr Zelensky in September saying if US support ends, then Ukraine loses. People here are still talking absolutely in terms of what happens after the victory, in terms of the progress that Ukraine is making towards joining the European Union, and talking about how freedom of the press, investigative journalism is such an important component of that. Whether or not that means that Ukrainians are still ultimately confident that this aid will end up coming through, or simply that it hasn't sunk in yet just how bad the situation is, I'm not sure. But the mood this evening is not one of sort of tragedy and panic anyway.
All right, no panic yet. Meanwhile, guess who's coming to dinner here in Paris in order to break the deadlock ahead of next week's EU summit? Emmanuel Macron inviting Viktor Orban for a working dinner, that's how it's described, on several subjects, including, quote, various aspects of European support for Ukraine. A 50 billion euro financial lifeline is in the balance there. Yves Dutrieu, what do you think of this move by Emmanuel Macron to get ahead of what will be a brewing crisis next week, what will make for long negotiations, invite Viktor Orban, even though he's not flavor of the month in Brussels, and try to convince him, seduce him, if you will?
I think it's normal. When we have a problem, we have to speak with a troublemaker, if I may say so, because all these decisions regarding Ukraine will be taken by unanimous voting. So we need the support of Hungary. Since 2002, for the beginning of the Russian invasion, we have had a lot of difficulties with Hungary. And at each time, for instance, regarding economic sanctions against Russia, in particular on oil, for instance. So we had to negotiate with Hungary, not only France, obviously, but Brussels and all the other member states. They had to negotiate with Hungary in order to get its unanimous voting, at each time, it's possible, to get some for Hungary to get some compensation.
Yeah, it's just like what's going on in the United States. The Republicans want something when it comes to the border. Hungary wants the aid that's been withheld because of rule of law issues.
And until now, it had worked with Hungary each time. Now, for next summit, I don't know. The atmosphere is a little bit different. We have had this election in Slovakia, this election in Netherlands, and this lack of decision in the US Senate. And that could have a collateral effect on European Union support. I don't believe so, but there is that risk. Reason why we have to speak with Hungary.
Elena Tregu, what does your crystal ball tell you? Is the fact that you've had these elections where winners are more pro-Putin in Slovakia, in the Netherlands, does that embolden Viktor Orban, or is he just going to stick to his domestic agenda when he's having dinner with Emmanuel Macron?
I think definitely it emboldens him, and he raises his weight, and he basically demonstrates very clearly cracks in European Union unity, in NATO unity. This is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. And I think maybe even this meeting that President Macron is having can be counterproductive, because it will somehow empower Orban and, let's put it like, feed the beast, So we'll see how it will end, but it's very risky.
Gulliver Cragg, your thoughts on that other dinner that's taking place tonight, not the one where you are, but the one here in Paris at the Élysée Palace.
There's been a lot of debate about that I've been listening to on Ukrainian radio today, with analysts debating whether or not Viktor Orban is really acting as some kind of agent of Moscow, or whether he's just in a transactional position, and perhaps Emmanuel Macron will be able to offer him something in terms of French assistance with Hungary's nuclear power plant, and some hope being placed on Emmanuel Macron as a negotiator, on his charisma to convince Viktor Orban. But there is, I've heard also from European Union sources who are visiting Kyiv, a fear that maybe this time it's different with Viktor Orban, that maybe this time he really isn't going to end up caving in as he has done so far. It's really been hotly debated today in Ukraine. Tomorrow, I believe the Ukrainian Parliament is supposed to vote on a law about language rights, which has been the pretext that Viktor Orban has often used in his reluctance to let Ukraine into the European Union, and for his general beef with Ukraine, the rights of Hungarian speakers in the southwestern Transcarpathia region. And there again in Ukraine, there's a debate. What's the best thing to do? Make some kind of concession to Viktor Orban, or actually stand their ground, because everybody here views that as purely a pretext, and something that Viktor Orban is perhaps would not even be very happy if that pretext was taken away from him. A lot of second guessing going on about what's the best approach.
Yves Dutrieu, you mentioned an important factor. Next week, to get that 50 billion euro aid package over the line, you need unanimity. The vote that failed in the US Senate was a vote where you needed 60 votes, a lot of votes. How are institutions doing? Again, this is as we enter a third winter of war in Ukraine. When it comes to this is the West arguing with the fears there just described by Gulliver. How are the Western model doing when it comes to this crisis?
The problem is that the Western model, as you said, is a democratic model. So we need to convince our people. All these head of state government are elected by people. Orban has been elected democratically. So we have to take into account the view of everybody. But at the end of the day, I'm still optimistic that we will get it through because it's our own interest. The war, the invasion, the Russian invasion in Ukraine is a blow against the European Union. And Ukraine now is an official candidate to be part of the European Union, not tomorrow, but after, negotiation and so on. So, as you said rightly, our security is at stake in Ukraine. And at least the French, and not only the French, obviously, but the majority of the EU leaders and still population as well, if you look at opinion polls, are still in favor of supporting Ukraine. The problem is that this war now is more or less blocked, frozen. It's a frozen conflict. So to get the more support from the public, the Ukrainians, they need to get, counteroffensive and victories. And that's not the case. And they could say, the Ukrainians, that it's perhaps because of the EU and US, because the ammunition and additional weapons, aircraft and so on, are not there. So you see the contradiction. We need to have some success, Ukrainian success in Ukraine, and we are still reluctant to provide additional funds. That's a contradiction.
Yeah, that need for success is certainly a topic. And for the past months, we've also seen Ukraine with increasing issues with some of its closest allies. Polish truckers, at times flanked by farmers, in the past month have blockaded the border. They want an end to a visa waiver for Ukrainian transport, which they say undercuts competition. It's a France 24 report read by Gulliver Cragg, here present.
The queue of trucks stretches for miles. Tempers are short.
Та ти чуєш мене, що я тобі говорю? Я тобі 15 раз кажу, що я говорив, щоб їхало 7 машин з кожного парку.
There's no sign of a let-up in these Polish truckers' protest against what they see as unfair Ukrainian competition.
Our main demands from the European Union are the restoration of the permit system for Ukrainian drivers entering Europe and the suspension of licenses for transporters financed by countries outside the EU.
Kamil Ambroziak, meanwhile, says he fears for his business if things don't change.
Around 30 or 40% of Polish transport companies have got no more work. Their trucks are at a standstill. It's a huge problem. This Ukrainian competition is a big threat for us and for the EU as well.
But many of the Ukrainian drivers, waiting for days in the cold, accuse the Poles of hypocrisy.
They're forgetting that when they entered the EU, they got huge subsidies and took over the German markets.
Kyiv has warned that supply problems could lead to energy shortages. Many, like Yuri Ostrovsky, suspect a deliberate attempt to weaken Ukraine and its war effort.
I think Russia's playing a role in this and that people are being paid to do this blockade because they're checking everything we're carrying.
An allegation strenuously denied by the Polish farmers who've joined forces with the protesting truckers.
Our farming sector is collapsing and the same is happening to the transport sector. No one is paying us to be here, not Putin or any organization. We're just simple farmers. Ukrainian grain arriving in Poland has destabilized our market.
If no agreement is reached before the end of the year, the Poles plan to extend the blockade as far as February.
Elena Trygub, there's a new government coming in Poland. How do you resolve this border problem?
Well, I think that the government should explain to their citizens that security comes first, and those are concerns, economic concerns of people. But Poland is at the border with Ukraine, and what unfortunately those people, the farmers and the truck drivers are doing is dangerous, because indeed they are undermining the defense of Ukraine right now. And I think there should be more clarity on that. During election, their politicians in Poland, they were, of course, playing with this issue, and they were all supporting those people to get votes and saying that they will be in favor of those actions. But now it just went a little bit out of control. As you can see, Ukraine economy is suffering, the war effort is suffering, and it can become also too dangerous, and it should be explained.
Yves Dutrieu?
We have to come back to square one. Why there are wheat and cereals at the Polish border? It's because the Russian ships on the Black Sea block the export from Odessa of wheat to Africa, Middle East, and so on and so forth. So perhaps the Polish farmers are collateral victims, but the aim of this export are not supposed to be Poland markets, but from Poland to the rest of the world through, the port of Hamburg or Marseille, to go to the countries who desperately need this agricultural export of Ukraine. So we have to explain all this to Polish farmers, and obviously they are not ready to understand that language.
Douglas Hay, this reminds me of the polling you were describing at the outset of our conversation. Putting aside, there have been disinformation campaigns over what's going on there, but it's that question of people seeing their needs, their short-term needs, their personal needs in this situation. You sometimes forget what's at stake here.
Absolutely. And I think that explains a lot of where the funding remains stuck, or why the funding remains stuck in Congress. And I would sign on to everything Yves said in his previous answer about lack of victories or those being seen in the United States. And part of that is we're also just seeing a lot less of Ukraine. Just a sheer matter of fact that a lot of the personnel, news personnel who were scattered throughout Ukraine are now in Gaza or in Israel. And so what we see on American television in our newspapers is a lot less Ukraine focused than it was certainly on October 6th, or especially 6, 8, or 12 months ago.
Yeah, Ukraine has been lobbying hard all week to get back on the radar. The President Vladimir Zelensky, who did take part in a virtual summit of G7 leaders on Wednesday, is defense minister in Washington. Rustem Umerov, seen here in the company of his U.S. counterpart, claims to have a plan for the battlefield for 2024. In an interview with Fox News, Umerov asserted Ukrainian troops have already passed 2 lines of defense in Russia and are now facing a third. But that's not how it's being reported in the U.S. Capitol. The Washington Post earlier this week reporting on the stalemate and differences since the spring, between the Pentagon and the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. The year began with Western resolve at its peak, Ukrainian forces highly confident, and Volodymyr Zelensky predicting a decisive victory. Now there is uncertainty on all fronts. The Washington Post reports that the U.S. wanted Ukraine to concentrate its forces on pushing towards Melitopol and driving a wedge between Russian forces heading towards the Sea of Azov, while the Ukrainians insisted on spreading their defenses out along the front. That argument, is that what you've been hearing, Douglas Hay, that argument between Kyiv and Washington has been going on?
That's certainly part of it. And but I think the reality is that while the Ukrainian ambassador here in Washington goes to about every event that she can, because she's making the case, and I think very strongly, every day, everywhere she goes, the reality is for voters, whether they're in Washington, D.C. or Washington State, when they turn on their TV, and it's been this way not just since the October 7 attacks in Israel, but even before that, Ukraine is not the daily dose of news consumption that voters are seeing. So it's fallen down on their list because there's just less attention that's paid for it. That is going to have a political impact.
Let me ask you the question, Olena Tregub, does the Ukrainian defense minister do a disservice to his own cause when he says that they've been managed to break through Russian lines on 2 of the 3 fronts, because we don't see the evidence of it yet?
Well, their front line is very scattered, and we had some groups that were successful in breaking those defense lines, but those were like very small advances indeed. And the problem here is that their expectations for the counteroffensive were artificially elevated. And for example, the military, the professional analysts back in Kyiv, they didn't even have those expectations. And it's good that Ukraine now is able to sustain a constant Russian attacks on the front line with as little as we have. It's good that we risked and we were able to retake some territories with no air cover, with not enough demining equipment. So it's a matter now here indeed of information, political communication issues here. But militarily, Ukraine was, in my opinion, never equipped even to make those breakthroughs that we are discussing here.
So the idea of fighting in 3 points, of resisting in Bakhmut, that was the right call.
Well, Bakhmut had geographical importance, and once the Bakhmut is taken, Russians could have taken the whole Donetsk region. So that was the reason, but there are arguments that maybe we were holding Bakhmut too long, and it was also due to political and image perception. So here you see yourself, your guest pointed out, and you, that we are playing here, it's a war, it's a real military operation, very heavy, very bloody, but at the same time, there are these viewers in America, in France, in Europe, and they want us to see succeed. But the people who are dying are Ukrainians, and the commanders were trying to save lives and trying to limit this operation and make those small advances which I mentioned.
It's true that it's easy to give recommendations and advice from Washington, Pentagon, and so on. They are not those who risk their lives. But I am not a military expert, but I can understand the argument that sometimes you have to make a push on a specific location rather than on 3 or 4 different locations. The front line is very long. I think it's something like 1,200 kilometers. And the Russians are very strong on their defense capacity. And it would be wise to try to cut down to the Black Sea from Melitopol, as it has been said on the map. It would be wise, but for that you need to have much more ammunition, artillery, and even air coverage that is not there, just there. And speaking about ammunition, even us in Europe, we have no more ammunition. We dispatch ammunition already to Ukraine. There is a plan from Brussels to speed up the production of ammunition.
So far, they've produced 1/3 of what they said they would.
Exactly. So you see the challenge. There are so many priorities, even in Europe, that it's complicated. And I hope that we will go through.
Yeah, please don't be under the impression that Ukrainians were trying to push along this long line. There were no frontal attacks. Like I said, those were very careful operations, even sometimes gathering intelligence where the Russians have deficiencies in their defense lines. And what we're talking about, Melitopol, when you say this big concentrated frontal attack, was Ukraine equipped for that? How many Ukrainians would have died? Ukrainians, when they were advancing, they were covered with drones, with Russian bombs, planes, artillery. So we were not there on the ground, but from what we analyze, Ukraine was not equipped properly. And so this post-factum analysis of mistake, it should take place, but definitely Ukraine should not be blamed for not being successful under these circumstances.
And in the face of it, Douglas Hay, there's the reasoning that even if the war was poorly prosecuted by Moscow, all Vladimir Putin has to do is run the clock.
No, he made a bet very early on, in fact, probably before he launched this, that he could outweight the West and certainly outweight the United States. And what we've seen is that possibly is true as we have questions about whether or not we're going to pass this round of funding, whether it's next week or in the early weeks of next year. All of this speaks to Vladimir Putin's key bet potentially being true. It's why it's so important that Republicans hear different messaging on this, that their voters, Republican primary voters, are hearing different things just than the day-to-day struggles on the battlefield, which even then they're hearing less. Why this is good for jobs in the United States, which is not what most voters would think of when it comes to funding for Ukraine. But we're spending money here to help Ukraine. These things would help bump up those numbers for Republicans so that Republican members might be more supportive of this and then push back on Putin.
Now, 2024 is going to be an election year in the United States. It's also, perhaps, we don't know yet, going to be an election year in Ukraine. Normally, Volodymyr Zelensky is up for re-election in March of 2024, and we're starting to see tensions with the mayor of Moscow, Vitaly Klitschko, tensions with his own army chief of staff. Is that election going to happen? Should it happen?
Well, we as civil society, even though we are all pro-democracy activists, we made a collective plea to Ukrainian government and to our partners abroad, saying that we are against this election. We think it's counterproductive. Please remember, for example, when England, which is a democracy, didn't have election from 1935 till 1945. And it's okay, it's war. And even tension around election can create those waves that you are discussing. During wartime, it's just dangerous.
So let's break it down. Is there a problem between Volodymyr Zelensky and Valery Zaluzhny, his army chief of staff?
Currently, we observe the return of politics to Kyiv. After the full-scale invasion started, we had no politics for a while because everybody was focused on security and war. And now we see those signs, and these signs are not good because Russia counts on Ukraine cracks from within, just like Russia counts on those cracks in European Union and NATO. And I think this should be also treated very carefully, and Ukrainian society, we understand very well that it's dangerous, and we try to tell to our politicians that it's not time to express any fights in their egos and so on, because definitely.
And when the mayor of Kyiv warns that we may be drifting towards authoritarianism, Vitaly Klitschko's words, is that
I don't agree.
You just take it as just a bit of politics, a bit of...
I do. I think it's just his criticism. I'm anti-corruption activist in Ukraine. We now created Anti-Corruption Council of the Ministry of Defense. We now pushing Ukrainian government to create different new procedures for procurement, and we as civil society can speak whatever we want to say. So I don't really feel this authoritarianism yet, but it's a martial law. We are at war.
Gulliver Cragg, and as you know, we're speaking from Paris, and France is a country that has 67 million politics junkies. The fact that right now the elections are off for the time being because of the martial law, how's that going to pan out in 2024?
Well, as I said, at this gathering of investigative journalists here just outside Kyiv at Yanukovych's former mansion, these are people who are very critical of the authorities. I've just heard one of them lashing out at the former defense minister, Oleksiy Reznikov. But they would say, I think, that their very existence, the fact that they can hold an awards ceremony, the fact that they've done all sorts of reports criticizing the authorities is proof enough that Ukraine is a functioning democracy where there is freedom of speech, and that Vitaly Klitschko's assertion that it's drifting towards authoritarianism and comparable to Moscow is simply absurd. And I'm sure these people also would agree with Olena that it's not the time to hold elections, that the risk of elections being used by Russia to further destabilize and weaken Ukraine is simply too great, not to mention the cost of it and the difficulty of organizing them in a fair way. There really is a political debate here. There is criticism of the authorities, but I think that there is, for the moment, though it may change if political parties and different actors try to, play things the way they want to. But I think for the moment, the consensus of public opinion in Ukraine is an agreement that it's not the time for elections.
Yves Dutrieu?
I agree on that. Exceptional circumstances. You refer to UK, you could refer to France between 1914 till 1918 or even 19. There were no elections. And it was democracy. The parliament was still working.
Yeah, they changed prime ministers 5 times during World War I.
Yes, but no election, no general election. But at the end, there was Clemenceau, at least, as a prime minister, president of the council. So how come you would organize an election when 15% of the territory is occupied by a foreign country? It's quite impossible. So as a lawyer, now I am a lawyer, I fully understand the theory of exceptional circumstances. It's very different in Moscow, because there will be election, but there is only one candidate, and everybody knows already the outcome. Contrary to Ukraine, which is a vibrant democracy.
So, a vibrant democracy, but under attack. And that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier, about the model. The rest of the world looks at this fight. What are they thinking right now?
On the fighting.
And just the model, of Vladimir Putin versus, Vladimir Putin was in the Gulf earlier this week, who today welcomed the Iranian president.
It's true. It is true that Russia has a lot
and how that's perceived in the rest of the world.
It's true that Russia has a lot of advantage. And we have to recognize that the economic sanctions have not been so efficient versus Russia. Russia has been able to, to go in and around selling its oil to India or to China or to other countries. So Putin has still a lot of, financial resources in order to relaunch a war economy and to relaunch the armament industry. And it's, even his human capacity is bigger, obviously, than the Ukrainian one. They have 140 million inhabitants versus 40 around in Ukraine. So on the long run, somebody said earlier that, you said that he's playing with a clock, Mr. Putin. It's true. And they are used to play on the long run. And for that reason, it's important for the West, EU and the US, to still be there to support Ukraine. Otherwise, we'll have a frozen conflict for decades, and even the possibility of a victorious counteroffensive of Russia, for instance, around Kyiv. That's because they are
even
targeting.
Even Kyiv is not excluded.
At the outset of this conversation, Douglas Hay, you mentioned the polling you had done among U.S. Citizens who put Ukraine way down on the list. How about when you frame the question about whether democracy and the messiness we described going on Capitol Hill right now versus strongman rule?
Well, unfortunately, this was a poll of Republican primary voters, and we know where Donald Trump is in the Republican primary. And with his recent comments just this week, clearly there's a big part of the Republican Party that is attracted to that and is drawn to that.
Remind us of those comments.
I'm sorry?
Remind us of those comments.
Where he said he'd be a dictator, but he wouldn't be a dictator except on day one. And I think we know with Donald Trump that probably means day 2, month 3, year 4, for as long as he could keep that. A lot of Republican voters appreciated that. They clapped when he said that. So this is where the Republican Party is. There's a real divide here. There's a hunger from some to fund Ukraine and certainly within the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, but it's not where voters are. And again, there are two reasons for that. And the most important one, I think, these days is it's just fallen in the public attention span. It does not get the conversation today that it did a year ago or certainly before. And that's because we're not seeing it every day on TV like we used to. So it's sort of out of sight, out of mind for a lot of Republicans and even independents or Democrats.
So explain this for our viewers around the globe, Douglas, because in the past year, China's economy has slowed dramatically. Economists forecast that a lot of the world's growth over the next year, 45% of it, will go towards the United States. It's going to be one of the big drivers of global trade and growth. So the U.S. is doing better on the world stage economically, but it doesn't want to be the world's policeman anymore. It doesn't want to be the one that has troops around the globe. Why is that?
Well, two things. One, yes, the economy is doing better. Our unemployment rate is very low. But people are still upset every day when they buy anything, whether that's a small item or a big item, or they can't buy something because they can't now afford a new car or a new home given interest rates. The economic anxiety in the country is very broad and bipartisan in that sense.
But how does that turn? How does that turn to isolationism?
Well, I think Americans are focused on themselves and domestic issues first and foremost, and then the second part of that, comes from what we've seen over the past 20 years. I don't think it's surprising that there's a hesitancy now. It's something Donald Trump exploited in his first run in 2016 for boots on the ground, even though that hasn't happened yet, to be the world's policeman, because they've seen what's happened in Afghanistan. They've seen what's happened in Iraq. And Americans are very nervous about that role and how that's gone wrong in recent history.
Olena Tregub, in a perfect world, Ukraine doesn't need anybody to defend itself, right? It can stand on its own 2 feet. What's the view going forward now in terms of, because we had, for instance, this week, looking at a United States that might become more isolationist, the UK describing some kind of new defense alliance spearheaded with Norway, alternate plans. For now, NATO is the only game in town, though.
Yeah, that's right. Well, what's happening now in the United States should be a wake-up call for Europe, because indeed, if things will continue in that direction, Europe can be left alone with this war on their territory, essentially. Ukraine protecting Europe from Russian aggression, and Europe is the ultimate goal for Russia. European Union, I mean, and NATO countries. So, of course, we have not seen their acceleration of production in Europe at their sufficient level. So far, the military production and European leadership countries, they should very quickly now make those decisions, because it may be too late, because Russian war economy is accelerating and has accelerated. And so I just think that Ukrainians will keep fighting no matter what. Ukrainians do not have any choice. It's existential war. All those pretexts that Putin said that maybe you become neutral and I will stop the war. Of course, it's not true. And he just wants to destroy Ukraine, as we said, vibrant democracy, as a country, European country, future member of the EU, and then he wants to move on further. He wants to restore Russian empire, which he has imagined in his brain. So this should be definitely very much looked at here in Europe, in France, because those are very, very bad signs we now observe from, like you said, global policemen.
Gulliver Craig, in the last days, there's been a lot of reporting on the Russians holding back so they can target energy infrastructure when the temperatures really get cold for winter. How is it looking where you are?
Well, it's pretty cold today. I'm a little bit skeptical personally about whether or not Russia's really going to do this. The Ukrainian air defenses are very good at shooting down the Russian drones and the Russian missiles. They may waste a lot of these pieces of equipment and ammunition without actually achieving very much. And it's very, very bad, of course, for Russia's image. At the moment, perhaps they are looking to seeing a weakened Ukraine having pressure to go into negotiations, and Russia having a massive bombing campaign on Ukrainian infrastructure, again, showing how much civilians are going to suffer, is perhaps not the best look if the Russians are trying to convince Western countries that maybe now's the time for negotiations and that they could be a reliable partner for negotiations. Of course, Kyiv does not see Russia as a country that can be trusted in any way and doesn't see any sense in negotiations, apart from the principle that it doesn't want to give up territory. The point is, as Elena was saying, that Russia's ambition is to control the whole of Ukraine and beyond. It's not really something that anyone in Ukraine can take seriously, the idea that if Ukraine just made a few territorial concessions in some negotiations, that would solve the problem.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Gulliver Craig, many thanks for joining us outside of Kyiv. I want to thank Olena Tregub, Yves Dutriot, Douglas Hay in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Now, Paris is